you?
Thank God. How was your week so far?
Oh, just delightful. Welcome back.
Thank you. It's great to be back. So this week is Parshat Ki Teitzei. And if you're following in the book, in the Chumash, it's the portion of Devarim, in the book of Devarim, the book of Deuteronomy. In our blue art scroll Chumash, it is found on page 1046 in the blue art scroll Chumash. Let me just say that if you're following the book of Deuteronomy, it's the fifth Torah portion. I'm sorry, the sixth Torah portion. And it's Ki Teitzei. Now, what's very unique about this Torah portion is that we know there are 613 commandments, 365 negative, 248 positive in the entire Torah. And this week's Torah portion has, I believe, 74 commandments, which is the largest number of commandments in any singular Torah portion. So it is very, it's not that long of a Torah portion necessarily. It has exactly 110 verses, which is nice size, but not the largest necessarily. But it has more commandments than any other Torah portion. There are many portions that have no commandments. They're just stories, as you know. Back in the book of Bereshit, we had a lot of Torah portions with stories. Joseph and the brothers, Jacob, Abraham, Isaac. And of course, we learn from our stories as well, but there are no explicit commandments. And then you have this week's Torah portion, which has 74 commandments. So the opening verse talks about war and moral, ethical guidelines for the battlefront. Now, many times, soldiers, as you know, in war, God forbid, will take advantage of their enemies' women. They'll abduct them, capture them, and use them for their own physical pleasure. And this is, sadly, what happens many times on the battlefield in war. And the Torah discusses this phenomenon. A Jewish soldier who is attracted to and lusting after a woman of the enemy camp, one of his captives. Now, I use the word lusting because the Torah doesn't use the word ahava, he loves her. The Torah says v'chafatzta ba, which means you desire her. You are lusting after her. Now, we all know that lust and love are not only different, but opposites. Love is about the other person. Lust is all about yourself. Love is about giving. Lust is about taking. So what does the soldier do? And this might be a very unique example. The Torah is, on the one hand, idealistic. On the other hand, the Torah is realistic. Idealistic and realistic combined. So while the Torah tells us what the ideal is, the Torah also has to deal with human nature. So, for example, totally different example. When the Torah talks about going on the road and you see your enemy's donkey collapsing under its weight, the Torah says that you may desire not to help him. Nonetheless, says the Torah, azov tazov imo, you should go help him. V'chadalta me'azov lo, your natural impulse is to refrain from helping this person, because after all, this is your enemy and his donkey collapsing. You may even have a good feeling that he's suffering, that he's going through a hard time. But the Torah says, are you able to hear me, or am I still cutting out?
Now I hear you, but it keeps cutting out.
Okay, if it happens again, let me know. I'll move to a different room, okay?
Okay, sorry to interrupt. Thank you.
No, I appreciate the feedback.
Hi, Rabbi. Thank
Hi.
you.
Okay, let me know if I cut out again so I could go to a different room if necessary.
I don't hear
okay?
a cutout, and I'm downstairs. So Nancy, could it be yours? Or I don't know. It seems smooth to me.
Okay, so basically the Torah says that your natural impulse is not to want to help your enemy. And sadly, you may even be happy that your enemy is suffering. But the Torah says, go against your nature and help the person anyway. So the Torah understands the human nature and the struggles of our natural human condition, our frailties, our human weaknesses, and the Torah addresses them and says, we know you have these human challenges, weaknesses, and despite them, overcome them and do what you're supposed to do. So here the Torah is talking to the soldier on the battlefield. He sees this beautiful girl, he's attracted to her, and he wants to take her and indulge in his desires. So what does the Torah tell the soldier? And here the Torah does something very unique. The Torah says, and this is Rashi's interpretation. Rashi says that this law is addressing the Yetzer Hara. We all know that every human being has two impulses, two modus operandis in their being, Yetzer Tov and Yetzer Hara. Yetzer Tov is your good inclination, all your positive inclinations and desires and impulses, all your feelings of wanting to do things that are righteous and noble and selfless and good come from the Yetzer Tov. And then there is the Yetzer Hara, which is all your negative desires. And one of them, of course, is hatred, like I don't want to help my enemy. And one of them is lust. So we don't deny it exists. We don't suppress it, but we wrestle with it. As a matter of fact, the word Yisrael, to be a Jew, means to wrestle with God and with man. We're constantly wrestling. Life is full of struggles. And most struggles are internal struggles. As it says in Ethics of Our Fathers, who is a strong person? One who overcomes his evil inclination. The greatest battle is the battle within. That's the greatest challenge. Not how many people you could control on the outside or overpower on the outside, but whether you could overpower your own desires. Self-discipline and self-control is the ultimate challenge of life. So now this soldier is struggling with lust for this beautiful, attractive woman that he encountered on the battlefield. So here Rashi tells us something fascinating, that God speaks in this commandment to the evil inclination. In other words, it's almost like negotiating with your evil inclination. And what does the Torah say? So we all know that one of the tactics of the Yetzer Hara is to try to bypass the rational thinking of a person. That's why it's called impulsive, right? You just act on your impulses. You don't think. The more time you have to think about what you're doing, the more likely you will gain the proper perspective and be able to make the right choice. But when you don't think, you just act instinctively, right? You don't use your head, as they say. You don't use your brain. You ever know the expression, someone does something really dumb, really stupid, gets themselves into a lot of trouble, and people say, what was he thinking? You ever have this experience? You hear about a famous person doing something so dumb and getting into so much trouble, and you say, what were they thinking? And you know what the answer is? They weren't thinking. If they were thinking, they would not have done it. But they just had a desire. They followed their desires, and they didn't think. So the Torah wants to give this man 30 days to think. So the Torah says, look, follow this prescription for 30 days. When you have this captive, this woman, this beautiful woman, don't lay a hand on her, meaning don't have any physical contact with her, but rather wait 30 days. And what should you do during these 30 days? The first thing is you should take off her attractive clothing that she was wearing and have her just wear ordinary clothing. And then, now, many times the women would go out on the battlefield to seduce the soldiers in order to weaken them. So they would deliberately make themselves attractive. So don't take off her beautiful clothing. Also, cut her hair, because hair is very sensual and it causes her to be attractive. And also let her nails grow long, meaning don't let her nails, her beautiful, don't let her manicure her nails, because these are all beautiful forms of a woman. And then wait 30 days. And the Torah hopes that after 30 days, she'll be crying that she wants to go home to her family again. And at that point, you will lose your desire. You will lose your interest in her. And if not, the Torah says, we'll prescribe a manner in which you could convert and you could marry her lawfully. And what we extract from this law, even though today we don't have these application of these laws, but the lesson is very simple. the lesson is that sometimes the best thing to do is hit the pause button. Sometimes when you're struggling with something, you need to slow down and you need to give yourself some time and take away the physical attraction of whatever it is that you're lustful for, and try to do things that will help you have the inner strength to overcome the desires that you have. And understanding that the power of your evil inclination is very real, and you need to build your strength to be able to overcome it. The Talmud says that what should a person do when a person feels that his Yetzer Hara, his evil inclination, is overpowering them? Talmud says you should drag your evil inclination to the synagogue, to the study hall. In other words, the environment you put yourself in helps you overcome whatever it is that you're struggling with. So by taking your evil inclination and going to the synagogue and engaging in prayer and in Torah study, you will get the spiritual wherewithal and fortitude to overpower your Yetzer Hara, your evil inclination. And, there's a parable told about the Yetzer Hara that he's like a wayfarer. This guy who was once like a guest. I'm trying to remember the exact story, but he knocks on a guy's door and he says, I want to come into your house as a guest. He says, can I hang my coat up on a nail, on the hook, on the wall? He says, sure. And he says, could I have a seat? He says, sure. He says, could I have something to eat? He starts eating. He says, could I find a bed? Yeah, sure. And then before you know it, he took over the house and evicted the owner of the house from his own house. And the Talmud says, the Yetzer Hara is like that. First he said, I just want to hang something on a nail. Then I want to have a seat. Then I want to have a meal. Then I want to have a bed. Before you know it, he's controlling your whole life. So the method is not to allow the Yetzer Hara to have discipline, to not even engage in the first place. Because once you go down that road, it's a slippery slope, and he gets you further and further, deeper and deeper into his grip until you've lost all control. We all know the phenomenon of addiction, right? If you don't begin an addiction, you'll never fall into the grip of it. But once you engage once, even in small measure, then he pulls you into the next stage and the next stage, and he gets you deeper and deeper, and it gets harder and harder to come out. I'm going to go, someone said we're cutting out, so I'm going to move into the social hall. So the point is, the Talmud says that kachu umnato shel Yetzer Hara. This is the tactic of the evil inclination. One day he tells you do this. The next day he tells you do that. And slowly but surely he causes you to drift further and further away from your original destination. And he is to not engage in the first place, and to not give in, because once you give your evil inclination, as they say, a finger, they want a hand. So the Torah tells us here that sometimes we have to deal with our very real desires. And here's the point. The point is sometimes people feel that, I have these negative thoughts, I have these negative feelings, I harbor whatever it is, hatred towards somebody, or jealousy towards somebody, or lust, or whatever it is, and they feel that maybe there's something wrong with them, or maybe they're not a righteous person, because if they were righteous, they would never have these negative feelings in the first place. And here the Torah is saying is that it's normal, to have these feelings. It's normal to sometimes, not have the most positive impulses or feelings, because we all have a good inclination and a bad inclination. Unless you're a tzaddik, a righteous person who's eliminated his Yetzer Hara and only has positive thoughts and positive feelings constantly, most human beings, which is like 99.9%, will have negative feelings or thoughts. However, the question is not whether we have them, but whether we engage in them or whether we reject them. And that's our free choice. We don't necessarily have free choice if we have these thoughts in the first place or feelings in the first place, but we do have the choice whether we're going to follow those thoughts and feelings or whether we're going to eject them and reject them and not follow it and overcome it. And we say in the Shema 3 times a day in the third paragraph, V'lo sasuru, do not go astray after your eyes and after your heart. It's normal for your eyes and your heart to lead you astray, but you have to choose not to go astray. There's a story told about a very religious woman, a righteous woman. She came from Europe to America, and her son became secular and less religious. And she came to her rabbi one day and she said, Rabbi, my son is meshuggah davar. My son has gone mad. Why? At est chazer, he eats pork. On a tanz mit meidlach, and he goes dancing with women. And she said, my son has gone mad. And the rabbi said, dein Sohn is nicht meshuggah geworden. Your son has not gone mad. And basically in Yiddish, he said to her, if he would eat women and dance with pigs, then he would be meshuggah. But as long as he's dancing with the women and eating the ham and the pigs, he's normal. The fact that you want to do certain things doesn't mean you're not normal. It just means you're a human being. You have good and bad. But it's our choice if we're going to indulge in those feelings, whether it's jealousy or hatred or anger or lust. There's a whole long list. And I think what the lesson here that's very critical is that not every feeling you have is necessarily good. You know, a lot of times people say, well, this is the way I feel. You know, I have to be true to my feelings. And what we have to realize that the heart is the seat and the source of the greatest, most noblest, loftiest, sublime, holy, sacred, godly feelings of goodness and love and all the wonderful, virtuous feelings that emanate from the heart. But the heart is also the seat of the greatest evil, okay? The greatest weapon of mass destruction is not nuclear, warfare. It's the human heart that wants to send nuclear attacks on human beings. In other words, at the end of the day, it all starts in the human heart. Okay, when you think about all the evil perpetrated throughout history by all the evildoers down to our day and age, it all stems from the human heart. The human heart is what motivated Hitler to murder 6 million Jews. The heart could be the source of the greatest evil or the greatest good. And so just being aware of that, just being in tune to that not everything my heart says to me is true. Not everything my heart says is right or good. Just because it's what I feel doesn't mean it's a right feeling or good feeling. And we're now in the month of Elul, and a big part of this month is to examine ourselves and our beliefs and our values and what we do and say, is what I'm doing right? And it's the mind that has to govern and dictate to the heart and control the heart. So that's the opening subject of this week's Torah portion. The second section, it doesn't seem like it's a sequence, but it is a sequence. The second section talks about inheritance. If a man married 2 women and he loves one woman and despises the other woman, but the woman he despises gives him his firstborn child, and he wants to cut out the son of the hated woman from his dutiful privilege of being entitled to a special inheritance as the firstborn child, a double inheritance. Says the Torah, you can't change the inheritance laws. Even though it was the woman you hate, despise, that gave you your firstborn child, and you want to maybe give the inheritance to the child of the woman you love, Torah says he's entitled to his special double inheritance as the firstborn child, and you can't eliminate him from receiving it just because you don't love his mother. So in this law, we have a lot of fundamental lessons. But the Torah says, the rabbis say that this follows the first section, that this woman who you were attracted to on the battlefield, because you ended up marrying her for the wrong reasons, you married her because of her physical attributes and qualities, not because of her character or her spiritual components. Eventually, with time, not only will you not love her, but you will actually come to hate her. And at the end, this will lead to you wanting to eliminate her child from receiving the double inheritance. The Torah says, no, do not put the onus of your mistake on that child. That child is deserving of his inheritance. And the fact that you fell out of love with his mother because you chose to marry her based on physical attraction rather than her qualities or her character should not be held against the child. And finally, the third section in this sequence is the laws of a rebellious child who doesn't listen to his mother and father. And here the Torah takes it a third step and says, step number one is you married a woman, not because you had anything in common with her spiritually. She wasn't even Jewish. She was from the enemy camp, but you married her because of lust. Then you ended up not loving her. And now the child that grows up from this relationship in a dysfunctional home and marriage will be a confused child, and even worse, a rebellious child, and will not listen to his father and mother, and now you will have difficulties and struggles with your child. So the Torah is showing us another very important principle of life, and that is, as our rabbis say in Pirkei Avot, one good deed leads to another good deed, one bad deed leads to another bad deed, or one good decision leads to another good decision, one bad decision leads to another bad decision. And that's why it's important, as we said, with the Yetzer Hara, not even to give an inch, because the minute you give in to him, he starts exerting more and more control over your life. And so you have to have boundaries, you have to set limits, you have to have red lines and say, no, I will not let you cross over this line. You will not tell me, like an addiction, when you take your first, when you indulge in your first substance abuse or whatever it may be, you're not addicted yet. But when you repeat that behavior a second time and a third time, you get deeper and deeper entrenched. And then it gets very, very difficult to extricate yourself from the situation. Going on to the next laws of this week's Torah portion. This week's Torah portion is the source for a very famous Jewish custom. In some traditions, other religions, a person dies, and they start having viewings and all sorts of things going on, and then 2 weeks later they announce a funeral. As you know, in Judaism, we believe that when a person is passed on from this world, they should be put to rest immediately. And there's a lot of reasons for this. One is that the soul returns to its source, and until the body is laid to rest, the soul cannot leave and go on to its eternal rest. And the soul is like trapped between this world and the next. And it's painful for the soul, so we want to free the soul. And that's one of the reasons why at a funeral we all participate in the covering up of the casket, because once we complete the covering up of the casket and say the Kaddish, that's when the soul is released from the body and the soul goes to its eternal rest. So by covering up the grave, we're allowing the soul to now be freed, because as much as we enjoy life, the fact is that for the soul, living in a body is to some degree painful, because the soul is trapped in a limited, finite body, and it has a neighbor like the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination, that it always has to struggle against, the good soul against the bad soul, the godly soul against the animal soul. But once it is released, it goes back to its heavenly abode, where it lives in a world of righteousness and a world of godliness. Now, you may say, well, why did the soul come into this world in the first place? But that's the whole point. God wants the soul to overpower the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination, or the animal soul, and be able to elevate the body of the human being, to refine the physical existence, the world and the body of the person. However, in Jewish tradition, we try to bury a person as soon as possible. What is the source for that? Where do we find this in the Torah? So it's actually in this week's Torah portion. It says that if somebody was condemned to death for committing a capital crime, Torah says you should bury the person after he was put to death on that very day. Why? Because, listen to this, because this person who was executed, he was hanged for committing some crime that was capital offense, is in the image of God, and therefore, as Rashi says, there was once a king who had a twin brother. Listen to this beautiful parable. And this brother was a criminal, and he was put to death. He was executed. He was hanged in the gallows. And the king said, bury my brother immediately. Don't let him lay hanging in the gallows, because it's a disgrace for me. Because whoever looks at my brother thinks it's the king who is being hanged, because I'm a spitting image, an identical twin. Says God, every human being is in my image. And therefore, even when the worst human being commits the worst crime and he's hanged in the gallows or put to death, he's still in my image, this human being. And therefore, it's a disgrace. It's a shame for God, because God says this human being is in my image. He's my child. And therefore, God says, put him to death immediately. Put him to burial. Lay him to rest immediately. Even he deserves a proper funeral as soon as possible. And therefore, we learn from this that if the worst person deserves it, surely a righteous Jew, that every Jew should be given a proper burial, because as soon as possible, on that very day. Now, in America, rarely do you hear of someone dying and being buried on the same day. But in Israel, I want you to know, the custom is, especially in Jerusalem, to put people to rest on the very day they died. And that's why in Israel, they do something that you don't really see ever done in America. And that is they have funerals at night, because if someone dies during the day, whatever time it takes, I personally have attended funerals in Jerusalem, 11 o'clock, 12 o'clock at night. And you stand in the cemetery doing a funeral in the middle of the night, because they don't want the body to remain overnight in order to fulfill the obligation of this verse to bury the person on the very same day. Because every human being is in the image of God. If you follow the news, I saw that this guy in California who was accused of killing his wife, Patterson, I forgot his last name, the Supreme Court just ruled that he shouldn't be put to death. He was on death row. But it reminds you what kind of a human being we're talking about. We're talking about someone who was condemned to death. It means he's a real evil person. Yet the Torah says he's still in the image of God. And from a positive perspective, it shows us how to value every human being, to recognize that no matter what a human being does in their life, they are always in the image of God. They always have the Tselem Elokim upon them, and it's derived right here in this section. We now come to chapter 22. As I told you, there's 74 commandments in this week's Torah portion, so every few verses is yet another commandment. So the next commandment talks about returning lost objects. Hashavat ev aveda. So unlike the phrase that says finders, keepers, losers, weepers, Judaism believes that it's a mitzvah to return a lost object to someone who found it. And the Torah says if you find something, you have to take it into your possession and hold on to it until you seek out the proper owner of this object. And not only an object, but even if it's an animal, it's a donkey or an animal that you have to now take care of. You find a dog, a stray cat. You may think, well, I have to worry about this animal, I have to take care of it, I have to take it for walks, I have to feed it. So it says the Torah, yeah, that's your obligation. I'll tell you something interesting that I read or I heard in the news. In Israel, there's an organization called Tsar Balei Chayim. Now, Tsar Balei Chayim means there's a commandment in the Torah not to cause pain to animals, to human rights, animal rights, to treat animals compassionately. So there's a dog shelter, just like we have here shelters for animals, rescue animals, for animals in Israel. And they said something quite fascinating. They said, this report out of Israel says that when the quarantine began, right away when the pandemic broke out in March, a lot of people started giving up their dogs. They started coming to the shelter saying they want to give away their animals. Why? Because people were scared. They didn't know how this pandemic travels, how it, is it animal to human contact? So a lot of people got scared that maybe through their dogs, they're going to catch the coronavirus. And if you remember in the first few weeks, there was questions about animals. So hundreds of dogs started showing up at the shelter, people who didn't want their dogs anymore. And the one who runs this organization said they didn't know what's going to be because they were afraid they were going to get thousands of animals. And what are they going to do with that? Suddenly, a new trend emerged. People started coming to the shelter saying, we want to adopt a dog. Why? Because a lot of people were in isolation. They were lonely. And when they were sitting cooped up in their apartments or in their homes, they needed a companion, they needed a friend. And a lot of people who, when they were working, said, I can't adopt a dog because, I have to go to work every day. Now they're sitting home and they have nothing to do. And they say, I would love to have a companion. And suddenly every one of their dogs, not just the hundreds that were returned in the beginning, but even every dog in the shelter was taken up. I don't know what's been going on here in West Palm Beach with the dog shelters. Somebody just texted a message here that says here in Palm Beach has empty dog shelters. So apparently this phenomenon is not just in Israel, but here as well, that people started to come and adopt animals for companionship. So here the Torah says, if you find someone's animal, not just an object, you have to take it and take care of the animal until the owner comes and claims the animal. And the Torah says, if you see an object, you may say, you know what, I'll pretend like I didn't see it. I'll go on my merry way. And Torah says, no, once you see it, you have an obligation to go after it and gather in that stray dog or that stray donkey or whatever it is, or pick up that object. And now you have an obligation to try to seek out the owner of this object to fulfill the mitzvah of Hashavat Avedah, returning lost objects. And I'll tell you an amazing story I remember happened in Israel a few months ago. It's a fascinating story, but it was a true story. Maybe you could Google it and find it, but it happened maybe 4 or 5 years ago. It was a girl in Jerusalem, a young woman who got married, and she lost her diamond ring. And she realized that it had fallen into the garbage. She was cleaning dishes or whatever, and when she was washing the dishes or throwing things in the garbage, it slipped off into the garbage. But by the time she went out to her garbage can, they said that the garbage collectors had already taken it to the dump. And they said, look, it's somewhere in the dump in Jerusalem, there's like tons of trash that they picked up for the past day, and you're going to look for this diamond ring. So someone put up like a WhatsApp or a Facebook notice that this newly married bride, lost her diamond ring. And if anyone wants to come volunteer to find this ring, we're meeting at this, municipality, dump, garbage collector, collection dump, and we're going to be looking for this ring. And apparently, like hundreds of people showed up. Could you imagine wearing gloves and covering their mouths? And they dug through piles and piles of trash that was in this, in this sanitation, area where they disposed of all the trash. And they looked for hours and hours until someone actually found the diamond ring and returned it to the bride. And this was a documented story in the Jerusalem papers, how all these people came together to fulfill this mitzvah of Hashavat Avedah, helping someone find a lost object. And just to mention something that the Chafetz Chaim says, he says that if you have to return a lost object, and that's a tremendous mitzvah, how much more so the mitzvah of returning, of not just returning a lost object, but returning a person to his loved ones. Sometimes people are people could fall out of, have a falling out with one another, parents and children, brothers and sisters. And if you could be the facilitator to return a person to his parents or siblings to each other, whoever it is, friendships that have been lost, there's lost friendships, there's lost family ties. If you could reestablish those ties and return them to their loved ones by creating peace, that is obviously the ultimate form of returning a lost, not object, but person to their rightful owner, meaning their loved ones. And to take a step further, sometimes you could help return a person to themselves. The expression, they say this person is lost. We often use that expression. They're lost. And therefore, if you help them find themselves, find their own purpose, their own meaning, their own confidence, their own belief in themselves, self-esteem, that's the ultimate form of Hashavat Avedah. So don't only think of it in terms of inanimate objects, returning someone's wallet. don't only think about it of returning an animal, but think about returning people to their former relationships, or returning a person to discover themselves. I'll tell you one of the most amazing experiences I had, which taught me an amazing lesson. I was in Israel with a group of our members of our shul a number of years ago. And I won't mention the person's name because maybe he doesn't want it to be publicized. But there was a certain person on our trip who never had a bar mitzvah. Never had a bar mitzvah, and he joined Palm Beach Synagogue. He was getting closer to Yiddishkeit, and he came on this Israel trip. So I said to him one day, I said, if you want, we could go down on Monday morning to the Kotel. We'll put on tefillin, we'll do the morning service, you get called to the Torah, and you'll have a bar mitzvah at the Kotel. He said, that would be great. So we taught him the blessings, and we got up early that morning, and we left the hotel. We took a taxi, and the taxi driver happened to be an Arab taxi driver. And we took the taxi, and we went to the Kotel, and we got out of the taxi, and we started going down the steps to go down to the Kotel Plaza. And we got to the bottom of the steps. He said, oh my gosh, I left my money belt in the taxi seat. He had like a pouch with not only his money, his shekels, his cash, but it had in it everything: his wallet, his license, his credit cards, and his passports that he came to Israel with. All of it was sitting in this pouch that he took in the taxi. He was taking it with him all the time, I guess. Figured he may need it, and he left it in the taxi. And I remember our heart dropped because A, we left it in a taxi that just pulled off. We saw the taxi leave. And B, we knew that it was an Arab driver. And we thought, oh my gosh, and I felt terrible because here he came to celebrate his bar mitzvah at the Kotel. And all he's going to remember is that he lost everything that morning, all his valuables. We started to run up the stairs, really scared. What's going to happen? Trying to maybe figure out how we could track down this taxi. We got to the top of the stairwell. We saw the taxi driver coming towards us. He drove off, and he saw we left it in the back seat. And he drove around, came back, and there he was, this Arab taxi driver coming towards us with an outstretched hand, giving us back the pouch with all of it in it. And this fellow, whenever I see him, we talk about this, and he says that was like the highlight of his trip, or one of the highlights, because here he went to do a mitzvah to pray at the Kotel. God gave him back his lost object, and his pain and suffering only lasted for maybe a minute or two, but also it showed us that you never know the goodness of a person. And this taxi driver wasn't looking for any reward. He just wanted to do the right thing. He was a good person. And so what you may think, oh, returning a lost object, to that person, it can mean the world. And a little effort to find the owner is a tremendous mitzvah that is one of the mitzvot of this week's Torah portion. Moving forward to the next Torah portion, the next commandment in this week's Torah portion, and that is to help your fellow on the side of the road. As we've mentioned earlier about your enemy, here it doesn't necessarily your enemy. It says if you see the donkey of your friend or his ox collapse on the side of the road, help the person. Now, we all know the feeling. We're driving down the street, we're driving down the highway, we see someone who had a flat tire, their car stalled, their car broke down. And, we got places to go. We don't have time to stop. There's a famous story about this guy who was driving his car, and he sees the car broke down on the side of the road. And he sees a religious Jew with a kippah standing on the side of the road. So he pulls over to help him. When he gets closer, he sees the guy. He's like, he looks a little Italian, Spanish, and he's wearing a necklace with a cross. He says, what happened? He said, my car broke down. He says, let me give you a hand. He helps him out. And then when he says, I'm a little confused, you're wearing a kippah and you're wearing a cross? The guy said, well, my mother always told me to always keep a kippah in my glove compartment. He said, if you break down on the road, just put it on, and eventually a fellow Jew will stop, to help a Jew wearing a kippah. So the idea of helping your brother in his time of need, when his car breaks down, or his donkey or his ox, this is yet another commandment in this week's Torah portion. Next verse, yet another commandment, because I told you there's 74 commandments in this week's Torah portion. The prohibition against cross-dressing. A man should not wear the garments of a woman should not wear the garments of a man. This is a prohibition in this week's Torah portion. Now, next commandment is famous commandment, and it's the only other commandment besides the commandment of honoring your father and mother that the Torah tells us that the reward for keeping these commandments is that you will have a long life. And this is the commandment of the mother bird. The Torah says if you see a bird's nest, you should not take away the chicks in the presence of the mother. But first you must send away the mother, and only then you should take away the chicks, the babies, because if you do that, it'll be good for you and you'll have a long life. And it's amazing that 613 commandments, but yet only 2 the Torah promises long life. One is honoring your parents, and one is sending away the mother bird. And the common denominator is, once again, showing compassion for the mother bird. The mother gave birth to these chicks, and don't take away her chicks in her presence. Honor the source of life. And our rabbis say that the natural instinct of a bird is when you try to catch it, it flies away. But this mother doesn't fly away. When she sees you climbing up the ladder to come to the nest to take away the chicks, she hovers over her nest because she doesn't want to abandon her chicks. So that mother instinct is what makes it possible for you to take the mother. Don't take advantage of this mother's love, but honor it. And that's the same thing with honoring your father and mother. It's about honoring the instinct of mothers and fathers to love, protect, and care for their children. Next commandment in this week's Torah portion. Every verse is yet another commandment, or almost every other verse, because there are 110 verses with 74 commandments. And that is the laws of safety. That's right. There's a commandment that when you build a home, if you have a flat roof, you have to build a fence around the roof. And there's actually a blessing you say when you put up the fence around your roof. Just like there's a blessing when you put a mezuzah on your door. There's something called a ma'akah, a fence. Why? So no one should fall off your roof. And as the Torah says, there should not be innocent blood spilled on your property. No innocent blood should be spilled on your property. And again, whether you have a roof and you actually put up a fence, which is the mitzvah literally, or figuratively, which is any safety precaution you take on your property to make sure that there's no injuries, no damages, no bodily harm to any person, whether it's shoveling, cleaning the ice from in front of your house if you live in Michigan and there's icy weather and you don't want someone to slip and hurt themselves, or whether it's having a fire alarm in your house or having smoke detectors or whatever it is, make sure there's good railings in your house or whatever it is. Or if there's a swimming pool, make sure there's a fence. That's more practical in Florida. Make sure there's a fence around your swimming pool, not necessarily your roof, because you may not have a flat roof. But putting up a fence around your swimming pool is a mitzvah because you're protecting life. And that is one of the greatest mitzvahs, if not the greatest mitzvah, to preservation of life. So this is the mitzvah of ma'akah, putting up a fence around your rooftop, or making sure there's safety measures and precautions. Every building has safety codes, making sure you have all the safety codes intact to prevent, God forbid, any harm occurring on your property, because you are responsible for your property to make sure that your property is safe and no innocent lives are lost in your property. One of the commandments further in this week's Torah portion is not to plant your vineyard with a mixture, in other words, you're not allowed to, hybrid different seeds together. Each species should be separate. Now, sometimes there are various fruits and things that are a mixture. You're allowed to eat it if someone else did it, but as a Jew, you're not allowed to mix the different seeds that God made to maintain the original species intact. Next commandment is a very powerful commandment, and this again returns to the prohibition against being cruel to animals. Don't plow with an ox and a donkey together. Why not? So the basic reason is because they have different strengths. The ox is much more powerful than the donkey, and putting the donkey alongside the ox will force the donkey to try to keep up with the power of the ox, which is cruel to the donkey to have to maintain the power of the ox. And if this is how sensitive the Torah is to the feelings or the physical being of a donkey, that it shouldn't have to be plowing alongside an ox, the same thing is true with two human beings, whether it's two students in a classroom or whether it's two employees in an office, to peer people who are not compatible with one another, who are not able to keep up with each other for whatever reason, because of temperaments, because of skills, because of abilities, is not fair and not just. And if we have to be concerned about an animal, a donkey, surely about human beings. And that's the compassion of the Torah even for animals. There are many other reasons given why not to mix ox with a donkey. And another one is quite fascinating, is that one of the differences between an ox and a donkey is that a ox, the difference between an ox and a donkey is that a donkey doesn't chew its cud, an ox chews its cud. And so if the donkey is plowing alongside the ox, the donkey will see the ox regurgitating its food over and over and over again and think that he got more to eat from the master for lunch than he got. And the donkey will be envious of the ox, thinking that the ox got more food to eat because he's constantly chewing its cud. And in order not to trigger that feeling of jealousy in the donkey, Torah says, don't plow with the donkey alongside the ox. So this is saying not only the physical exertion of the donkey are we concerned about, but even the emotional stress to the donkey, that he's envious of the ox who got more to eat than him. That too is cruel to the donkey. Torah in this week's Torah portion also has a very famous law that I'm sure you're familiar with, which is that you're not allowed to wear clothing that are made of wool and linen. This is called shatnez, and it is a chok, which means it's a commandment that there is no explicit reason given in the Torah for it. We just obey because God instructed us to obey it, even if we don't understand the reason. But God doesn't want us to wear garments that have the fibers of wool and linen together. Why wool and linen and not other forms of garments? Of course, the commentaries offer different ideas why, but ultimately we don't know the reason why. The Torah just says, don't mix milk and meat is a chok. It's like a super rational commandment. Don't mix wool and linen is also a chok. It's a super rational commandment. And I want you to know that in religious communities, there is something called a shatnez laboratory, where after you buy a suit, even if you see on the label that it's wool and linen, of course you don't buy it. But even if you buy a suit that says it's 100% wool, sometimes they'll use a little linen around the buttons or underneath the collar to give it a little more firmness. And so they go in this laboratory and they cut open with a razor and they check to make sure there's no linen fibers, and they seal it up and they give you a little label inside that this was tested by the shatnez factory. And I've been to shatnez factories as a child when I bought my garments there in Brooklyn to be tested to make sure 100% that there's no linen combined, because even a few threads of linen combined with the fiber make it in violation of this prohibition not to have wool and linen garments together. Continuing in this week's Torah portion are many, many laws, but since we're running out of time, I'm going to skip over to one of the laws later on in the Torah portion, and that is the law of if someone needs a loan, loaning them money without charging them interest, which is one form of charity. And there are many forms of charities discussed in this Torah portion, including leaving the gleanings, some of the gleanings of the field for the poor and the needy. There's also the laws of marriage and divorce, about how to marry someone under Jewish law and how to get divorced under Jewish law, all in this week's Torah portion. A very interesting commandment in this week's Torah portion is that when you get married, the first year you should remain with your wife and not go to battle. You know, the soldier is told you're exempt from the draft for the first year of marriage. And the Torah says beautifully, you should gladden your wife, make your wife happy the first year, and not go out to other duties and responsibilities, but focus on your marriage, on building your home. And then in this week's Torah portion, we have the laws of further about compassion to animals, that when you plow with your ox, you cannot muzzle their mouth. You have to allow the animal to eat while it's working in the field. And again, if this is the way we have to treat animals, surely how we have to be compassionate to human beings on the job, and how to treat your employees. And finally, at the two last sections of the Torah portion is, one is honesty in business, that you shouldn't have rigged scales in your workplace. In the olden days, they had a scale with stones that said a weight of 5 pounds or 10 pounds, and then they would put food on the other side. So make sure that your scales are adjusted properly, that you don't cheat people in business. And here actually the Torah also says, in the merit of this, you will have a long life on the land of Israel that God gives you. You will prolong your days. As you know, that when a person dies, the Talmud says when they come to heaven, they're asked 4 questions. And the first question is that you deal honestly in business. So honesty in business is a top concern of God, how we treated people fairly in our financial interactions. And here the Torah says that if you want to have a long stay in the land of Israel, if you want your days in Israel to be prolonged, you should have honest weights and scales. Just commerce practice is very critical to our longevity in the land of Israel. And finally, the very last section with which we finish this entire Torah portion is the commandment to remember Amalek. And Amalek, we know, was the first anti-Semite who came to attack the Jewish people. And today, there isn't a day that you can't turn on the Jewish news outlets and read of anti-Semitism somewhere in the world. Unfortunately, anti-Semitism is still a daily occurrence, literally. And here the Torah tells us about 300 years ago about a nation by the name of Amalek, who the Jews had just left Egypt. They were tired, they were weary from hundreds of years of slavery. And immediately a nation by Amalek came and tried to attack them and annihilate them. Now, of course, we know the Jews fought against Amalek and they won the battle with God's help. But the Torah says always remember the story of Amalek, because you always, as Jews, are going to have to be aware of the fact and alert to the fact that they're always going to be the descendants, the spiritual progeny of Amalek in every single generation of Jewish history, that like their forefather Amalek, whether it's physically or spiritually their progenitor, they will do everything in their power to destroy the Jewish people. And this is this blind hatred known as anti-Semitism, which begins with Amalek and continues in every generation. And God tells us that the war against Amalek is an ongoing war. It's a war that will never be won. It will always be an ongoing struggle and battle. And therefore, we have to remember to fight against those forces of evil who the Torah says are always going to challenge you and try to destroy you. And the Torah describes Amalek as below Yarei Elokim. They did not fear God, because God took the Jews out of Egypt, and they did not fear God, and they tried to destroy the Jewish people. And the worst part of Amalek was that why they're considered so evil is because the Jews had just come out of hundreds of years of slavery. You know, when Israel was formed in 1948, there was a little window of time that the world had compassion for Israel because the Jews had just come out of the concentration camps of the Holocaust, so the world had pity on Israel. Today, the gloves are off. There's condemnation of Israel. Israel is seen as the superpower in the region. And there's the BDS movement, and everyone's like David and Goliath. Now they see Israel as the Goliath, and the poor Palestinians, the ones they have compassion for rather than Israel. But in the beginning, okay, poor Jews, they suffered so much. Let's give them a homeland. Let's support them. But Amalek was such a ruthless nation that they didn't even wait. As soon as the Jews left Egypt, and the Torah says you were tired and you were weary from your experience in Egypt, they not only attacked you, but they attacked those in the rear, which were the weakest members who were struggling on the back because they had no strength whatsoever because of their experiences. And they went after the weakest and the most vulnerable. And this is the nature of anti-Semites. This is the nature of Amalek in every generation. They will take advantage of your vulnerability. Just like Amalek attacked those who were most weary and vulnerable in the rear of the camp, who couldn't defend themselves. That's what our enemies will do. And I think one of the lessons is, Torah says, Zachor lo tishkach, remember and never forget. Remembrance, learning from the past is crucial to make sure it doesn't repeat itself. Those who don't learn from history are condemned to repeat it again. But I think what the Torah is saying is, remember that your enemies seek out your weakness and your vulnerability. If they see you're weak and vulnerable, they'll exploit that and take advantage of it and attack you. And therefore, the Jewish nation always has to remain strong and powerful so that our enemies don't even think of attacking us, because they know that we are able and fully capable of fighting back. And if they sense any weakness or vulnerability, they will exploit it to their advantage. And therefore, don't think that they're going to have mercy on you. On the contrary, they'll take advantage of you, just like Amalek. There are always Amaleks in every generation. And therefore, we have to learn the lessons of history. And this word, Zachor, remember, has become one of the themes of the 20th century after the Holocaust. Remember, Zachor, remember the Holocaust. But of course, remember all the Holocausts in Jewish history. And the promise of never again, Lo Tishkach, will never forget and never allow this to happen again. And thank God, Baruch Hashem, as Scott Heimberger just showed us, we have the Kotel, we have the Western Wall, we have the Jewish homeland, and we cannot ever show our enemies that we will, God forbid, not stand up for ourselves, because our enemies are cruel sometimes and vicious and threaten to destroy us. And when they say it, they mean it, unfortunately. And let us hope that we're getting closer to a better time and age. We saw this peace agreement between Israel and the United Arab Emirates last week or 2 weeks ago. May this be the beginning of many countries realizing that they cannot defeat Israel and they cannot destroy us. And we will fight back. And we're not the weak and weary. And they have more to gain. It's more in their interest to make peace with us and work and live alongside us, because then we could help one another. And Israel is a generous country looking to help the region. But if they try to fight us, God forbid, like Amalek, they will be defeated, because God will stand on the side of the Jewish people. And just like he helped the Jews defeat Amalek and defeat every enemy throughout history, all those powerful nations that rose up against us are all in the dustbins of history. And we, Am Yisrael Chai, we the Jewish people, live on for eternity. And therefore those nations like Iran and others that threaten our destruction, they will go the way of the Amaleks, as the way of Egypt, the way of the Babylonians, the way of the Romans, the way of the Crusaders, all the generations of enemies, the Nazism, and those who stand with Israel and support Israel, like America, which has always been a true friend of Israel and continues to be a friend of Israel. They will be a blessed country, as God told the first Jew, Abraham, those who bless you shall be blessed, and those who curse you shall be cursed. So wishing everyone a beautiful day, a wonderful week ahead. I want to remind everyone that tomorrow night, Rabbi Shais Tal will be giving us a special Zoom, a wonderful rabbi, lecturer, speaker, author, thinker, about low holidays or high holidays, how to make this the highest holidays of your year. So please join us tomorrow night for the Zoom. We also sent out an email today that we're reopening the shul this Shabbos. Mazel tov. We were closed for a few weeks while the numbers were spiking, but now the numbers have come down. We're going to reopen, and we're even going to have a box kiddush that we've never had for a long time. So, Scott, if you want to make it back to Palm Beach for Shabbos, you can join our shul and davening and kiddush. And we're going to have a mini sermon for about 10 minutes this Shabbos as well. We're going to try to slowly get back to our normal routine. So wish everyone a good day. I hope to see you tomorrow night on Zoom, and hope to see you on Shabbat. All the best to everyone. Thank you all for joining us. Have a good day.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Rabbi.
You.
Take care.
Yasher Tov.
All the best.
Thank you.